So you want to say a few words?
I was going to what you said already, and I just want to, well, I can maybe just thank the team who supported, who submitted the question, who helped us throughout the summer, and the students into the fall and all. But there will be more of that again, but from the beginning to the end, it's good to acknowledge our support now for all the coming together. It's really, I always find it's rewarding to do a clinician initiated project, even if it's challenging to recruit and to get all this stuff done within the time frame. But I think hopefully we will engage in discussions that will be relevant and useful to address the question that is submitted in an adequate manner. And we want to save a lot of time for discussions and to try to see what the relevance of that and what next steps will be. Thank you.
All right, we're good to go. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our presentation on what we've been up to this summer, our research project, Transition to Adulthood, Steps to Employment for Youth with Physical Disabilities in Quebec, conducted by Cassandra, Fatima, Kinza, Kenny, and myself, with support from our awesome supervisors, Keiko, Linda, and Mehrnoosh, as well as support from the clinicians, Charlotte and Julianne. Okay, so here we have just a timeline. I'm just going to move this box out of the way. Okay, so here we just have a timeline for our presentation today. So we're going to start off with the background, look at the methods, how we went about answering our question. We'll see the results. Then finally, we'll have the discussion, the limitations, future direction, and takeaways for the clinicians, the real meat of this presentation. Okay, well, how this project came to start actually was the clinicians had some questions. So the clinicians specifically here at Lethbridge, Leighton Mackay, who currently work with youth with physical disabilities to support them during their transition to adulthood. The questions that they had were related to employment and how they could better support their clients and find out about what other resources exist. And the research question that was then generated was, what are the pathways and environmental factors relating to achieving employment for youth 15 to 25 years old with physical disabilities in Quebec? Now we'll be getting into the background. So before we get into our methods and findings, here's a bit of information. So our population of interest are youth with physical disabilities, including individuals 15 to 25 years old who are leaving school and entering the labor force. While this period can be difficult for all individuals going through this stage of life, there are additional challenges and barriers for youth with physical disabilities, including those with auditory, visual, language, or motor impairments. Secondly, employment was identified as an important focus due to it being a key aspect in the transition to adulthood. Employment is both important for financial security, as well as a key indicator of inclusion in society, providing individuals with a sense of fulfillment and purpose. Lastly, statistics from Stats Canada has shown that 19 to 39% of youth with physical disabilities are employed, ranging dependent on their severity. And comparing that with the overall youth employment rate of 55%, we can see there's quite a large disparity. Now we'll be getting to the methods. So for the first stage of our qualitative study, we conducted an environmental scan of existing policies and programs related to the employment of youth with physical disabilities in Quebec, which were retrieved from the Pathways to Accessible Youth Employment in Quebec report by Movahed et al. 2023, which is part of a larger project relating to accessible youth employment for Accessibility Standards Canada. After compiling a list of policies and programs, each research team member further researched them by conducting a scan of websites that were related in both English and French. Once the program details were finalized and compiled, a flow chart was then created that depicted the various pathways to employment for youth with physical disabilities in Quebec. We'll show more on that later. For the second stage, the recruitment of youth, family members, and clinicians was done through purposeful and convenient sampling techniques with the amazing help from the transition program team here at Lethbridge, Leighton Mackay. We were able to include 19 participants in our sample, but I'll talk about that in a few more slides as well. For the third stage, for data collection, we completed semi-structured interviews with the participants, either in person or virtually, depending via Zoom, depending on their preference. The only accessibility option that was needed for some of the participants was closed captioning, which was provided through Zoom. Interviews were approximately 1 hour long, conducted in dyads by 2 of the OT students, who guided the conversation using a semi-structured script with open-ended questions in French or English, where we probed for details about the factors that influence their employment journeys. Lastly, for the methods, the fourth stage, these interviews were then transcribed verbatim for data analysis using online software. English interviews were transcribed using Zoom's built-in transcription software, and the French interviews were transcribed using a software called Speak AI. These were then manually verified by the interviewers as well. The transcripts were then coded using Deduce software to classify the codes into potential themes that reflected the participants' perspectives on their pathways to employment. And the final step of the analysis consisted of defining and naming themes and potential sub-themes that captured important aspects from the data relating to the priorities brought up by the clinicians, as well as the environmental scan and ICF. Now we'll be looking at the participants. So as mentioned, we had 19 participants total in our sample. Our 13 youth with physical disabilities, ranging from visual, motor, hearing, and/or communication impairments. And we had 3 parents of the youth. For our secondary informants, we had 3 clinicians who are involved in the transition to adulthood for the youth. We were really impressed with the number of youth who agreed to sign up and participate, as we only had expected to maybe include 3 or 5 in our sample, but of the 18 youth we reached out to, 13 of them accepted and wanted to share their lived experience. So thank you very much for reaching out, clinicians. And here, furthermore, this is a demographic breakdown of the youth that was included in our study. Most of them were in their early 20s with a median of 22, 4 male and 9 female, 6 with visual impairments, 5 with hearing impairments, and 3 with physical or motor disabilities. We had a wide range of ethno-racial backgrounds, but the majority were Caucasian. All of the participants except for 1 had completed their secondary schooling, and 10 preferred for the interview in English, and 3 were in French.
So for the results, we identified common themes and patterns in our participants' experiences. We ended up with 3 main themes that illustrate the pathway to employment of young individuals with physical disabilities. These include a transition from school to the job search process and finally employment. The themes of job search process and employment are divided into sub-themes that are structured around the ICF framework. So they're organized into environmental and personal factors. We also included the sub-theme describing participants' experiences. We identified different factors that influence this employment pathway. So at the micro level is the personal support system. At the meso level are the employments and non-employment programs and services. And lastly, at the macro level is the broader social context.
One of the themes, as Fatima mentioned during our interview, was in the youth's experience at school. So in nature, the youth reported that their disability directly affects their learning experience as they study with their regular peers, despite receiving some accommodations. Due to the nature of their disability, there were often negative experiences due to inappropriate accommodations, environments, adaptations, and a few also reported that they were referred to the wrong education curriculum. So for example, they were meeting with their academic advisor and they've been misadvised about a program that they don't really want to be in. So there's also this stigma that they face while in school, which also adds in pressure and disrupts their learning at school. However, there were a few participants that mentioned receiving some great accommodation that allowed them to have a positive experience at school, and this allowed them to pursue their education to even the university level. For example, some of the participants had to transition to online school, which allowed closed captioning, digital notes, and that helped them find success as they were able to follow the content much more easier. So the accommodations for school usually consisted of providing a proper environment to study, giving them more time for assignments and exams, offering technology to help them access their notes, etc. These accommodations helped a few participants figure out how it could help them in a work setting. For example, one of our participants that cannot read fine print, aside from having a tablet to be able to enlarge the fonts, well, that participant managed to ask if it was possible to bring that tablet at work so that they can read those fine prints and revise to the customer the contracts they were giving out to be able to do their job task. Also, some participants also expressed that how being at school helped them to advocate themselves in the workplace. So one example was oftentimes the OSD would reach out to them, but if nothing was asked to the OSD, well, nothing would have been done for them and they wouldn't receive the accommodations. So for some of the youth, this translated into having to ask their employers to get the accommodations.
So moving on to the job search process, participants reported using different types of resources to find a job. They mainly use online websites such as Indeed, but they also use their personal connections, including friends, healthcare professionals, teachers, mentors, and family members. The environmental factors that have an impact on the job search process are the attitudes of potential employers and access to accommodations. So many participants experience stigma from employers during their interviews. They felt that employers assumed they couldn't perform all the tasks and that they would rather hire someone else than provide accommodations. However, a few participants experienced a smoother job search process when employers displayed positive attitudes towards them, such as being receptive, patient, showing empathy, and being more accepting of adaptations. In terms of accommodations, we found a lack of accommodations provided in the job interviews, especially for youth with hearing impairments. So they found that phone interviews were more difficult and preferred Zoom calls. Youth often explored accommodations by visiting the job sites before applying to see if they match their need and to identify potential accommodations. The personal factors that have an impact on the job search process are the skills and attributes and personal connections. A skill that participants often mentioned is self-awareness, as it helps youth with physical disability recognize their strengths and acknowledge the tasks they can do well. Advocacy skills were also found to be important for requesting accommodations that enable effective task performances, as well as creative problem-solving skills, as it helped youth to find alternatives for tasks that employers might see as challenging for them. Social skills were also found to be important for establishing connections with employers and integrating into the workplace. Finally, participants commonly showed resiliency, motivation, and determination in their job search process, and this reflects how they tackle challenges and pursue their employment journey. Personal connections, including staff members in programs, teachers, parents, and friends, were also found to facilitate this job search process. In terms of the impact of disability on the job search, it was found that youth with hearing impairments experienced difficulties with phone interviews. Another participants also reported they face greater challenges in their job search when using a wheelchair in comparison to a walker. And a clinician explained that difficulties in communication, which are influenced by disability severity, have an impact on the job search. Here is a quote that illustrates this last point. So, ce qui est le plus difficile, c'est quand les jeunes ont des difficultés de communication. Ça, c'est un obstacle qui est excessivement difficile à passer par-dessus parce que toute tâche nécessite communication. In terms of disclosing the disability, most of the participants disclosed their conditions to potential employers during their interviews. Yet, many reported challenges in various aspects of disclosure. Some struggled with timing, while others were unsure how much they should share about their conditions. A few participants reported difficulties with explaining their disability due to limited experience in this matter. Visible disabilities were even perceived as easier to disclose compared to invisible disabilities. It was found that disclosing their disabilities and stating needed accommodations help employers understand how to best assist youth with disabilities. However, disclosing could hinder hiring chances, as some employers could lack knowledge about disabilities and wouldn't know how to properly adapt their workplace. And this makes them less willing to hire youth with disabilities. And here is a quote that illustrates the challenges faced when disclosing their conditions. So a participant says, to disclose your disability correctly, not to disclose too much about your disability, and that would affect your capability to get a job.
So now we're going to move on to describing youth experience with employment. So the theme that we discovered were environmental and personal factors, as well as their experiences in the workplace. And we had sub-themes for each of these. So the first is the environmental factors with a sub-theme of accommodations in the workplace. So it's shown that employers tend to be more reasonable and accepting to accommodations when it's the youth who's the one that asks for them and suggests them. And a common accommodation that was mentioned was delegating tasks to other employees if the task couldn't be modified. Some participants, however, did not receive any support from their employers or received poor accommodations. Participants stated they wish that they had someone that was available at all times for them to report to, ask questions to, double check their work, and be available to assist them if they need. The next sub-theme is attitudes in the workplace. So we found that youth with employers that were patient, open, and understanding tend to receive more accommodations, and youth also feel more comfortable to ask for assistance and propose potential accommodations when this was the case. On the contrary, though, some participants did describe facing stigma in the workplace, such as employers' misconceptions and preconceptions regarding the youth's abilities, as well as having employers with continued high expectations of performance and not being understanding of the youth's abilities. One participant expressed how they felt that it would be beneficial for employers to ask employees with physical disabilities for feedback on how they can make the workplace more inclusive. Our next theme was the size of the company. So we did find that the size of the company appears to have an impact on the access to accommodations, where large corporations tend to have a more impersonal hiring process with a mindset that everyone's replaceable, whereas smaller companies tend to have a more personal approach and are more willing to help individuals with disabilities. Next is our sub-theme of training and orientation process. So the information on this theme varied from participant to participant and also depended on where they worked, where some youth had received the appropriate amount of information and training in a manner that best fit their learning needs, whereas others expressed not getting enough training and were expected to perform tasks on their own, even though they didn't feel ready or equipped to do so. Moving on to personal factors, common skills and attributes that were described by participants as being needed for work were having good social and communication skills, being self-aware, so knowing where their strengths and their weaknesses lie, and taking initiatives. Others also mentioned the fact that having a degree or a higher level of education is also important. Finally, we have experience at work with a sub-theme of developmental trajectory. So following discussions with participants, many illustrated how their stage of life is a key determining factor in whether or not they're going to enter the workforce, as a lot of youth focus on their schooling before starting a job. First work experiences included summer jobs, internships, and volunteer. We also found that finding the first entry-level job is actually the most challenging step in the employment journey because these jobs are the least adapted to the youth's needs. There are many applicants and youth have limited experiences. Finally, we have the impact of disability in the workplace. So participants described the importance of having a job in which the work environment and tasks match the youth's disability and needs. In general, participants described smaller workplaces with a longer learning curve, slower pace, less productivity demands, and more consistent routine as being more fitted to their needs. And workplace relationships were often impacted by the disability, particularly for youth with hearing and visual impairments, where they had challenges with positions requiring feedback and teaching, had challenges connecting with colleagues, and also navigating social dynamics at the workplace. So here's a quote from one of the youth. They said, "I didn't really work when I was in high school, doing more like just school things, just kind of doing one thing at a time because I felt like doing two things is really hard to juggle. Or like if you were, especially when you work full time and then you go to school, it can be a lot for some people. So I think on the edge of 18, I started working my first job actually."
For the personal support system, youth commonly perceive their parents as key support, as they guided them in their work options, connected them to programs, provided job prospects, and helped with interview preparation. Participants also found that peer support through programs helped with sharing experiences and employment advices. Many participants reported having friends who understand their conditions and advocated for them in their job places. Healthcare professionals and school staff members also support youth in their employment journey. Here is a quote that illustrates the importance of personal support system. So a youth said, the things that it takes a whole village to raise a child. I'm saying here that it also applies to fostering the independence of the adult. Because the village, should still be there helping the young adult out through this.
So in the meso aspect, we were also talking about the employment programs and services with the youth during the interview. We noticed that there were many programs and services brought up by the participants, aside from what we have found from our environmental scan. However, many clinicians reported that there are some communication issues between the ministries making the program and services, which makes it more difficult to refer. Also, some participants mentioned that some of the program were sometimes just not for them, as they are still functional compared to those with a more severe disability. Another thing that we noticed during our interviews is that the employers and youth were often unaware of the programs and services. So, participant suggestions would be to help the youth be prepared for employment during high school, help them develop their self-awareness and advocacy skills, to create new programs for youth who function fairly independently, and to promote the current programs more. So here's a quote from a participant that really shows the issue at hand. So they say that, in fact, I have the impression that the program we have for young people with more severe physical handicaps, they have the program and it's their mind. Because with my situation, I'm disabled, but I'm still functional. I don't think it's for me, but the assistance programs are really for people with a heavy handicap, not a light one, like mine.
So we also explored the impact of the broader social context on youth's employment journey. So the impact of the pandemic varied from participant to participant and also depended on their disability. So some youth had difficulty with online schooling, as well as the social interactions following the lockdown because of the use of masks, because of their hearing impairment. Others expressed how remote school was actually more accessible to them, and when work trainings were done online, it better fit their learning styles. Participants also expressed how the pandemic impacted their access to opportunities at work or at school, where job paths were limited due to restrictions or programs were temporarily closed at this time. And now for the stigma, a common theme described by participants was the fact that a lot of employers don't actually know how to handle people with disabilities or what tasks to allocate to them, leaving the youth feeling like a burden or unappreciated, and oftentimes leading them to quit the job. Interestingly, it was mentioned how school teachers are better trained as they're more considerate, whereas it's more difficult to find an employer who is this way in the real world. And one participant expressed how a lot of jobs nowadays are looking to hire individuals with a disability, but not for the benefit of this population, but actually to make their company appear more inclusive, implying that the hiring process is not genuine and being done for the wrong intentions. So this is a quote illustrating that from one of the youth. They said, "Now I guess the fact that there are many jobs out there that are looking for people who have disabilities to explicitly show that they're providing inclusion. like the whole trend of allowing everyone to have jobs, even if the person has either cognitive, a social, or a physical disability or auditory, it doesn't matter. Everyone should have a job. That includes people with disabilities.
So during our environmental scan, these were all the programs that we managed to find involving youth with physical disabilities looking for employment. And then we split them into corresponding pathways, which are the healthcare system, the education system, and the employment system. Anything related to the employers would fall into the last category. And we also added a description towards the back that describes these programs. However, our flowchart changed after meeting with the participants, as they have mentioned so many programs outside of what we were able to find online.
So here are the programs that are currently offered in Quebec in the healthcare system, the education system, and the employment system, as well as the programs that offer services to employers. So programs in the healthcare system include Project Inc., which is one of the employment-specific programs within the transition program. And we also have the Montreal Association for the Blind. The education system offers programs such as Transition from School to Active Life, or TEVA in French, the Work-Oriented Training Path, and Socio-Vocational Integration. The employment system programs include the Grant Program for Adaptive Business, the Employment Integration Contract, or CIT, the Work Readiness Skills Program for people with disabilities, Duo Emploi, l'État, MEMO Québec, Service Externe de Main-d'œuvre, so CEMO, Andiqwar, and Horizon Travail. And finally, CIT and Grant Program for Adaptive Business offers services for employers as well. So we will be providing this pathway to clinicians, and we'll also be publishing it online so that it could be accessible to families and other healthcare professionals.
Okay, so now we'll move into the discussion. Now that we've seen sort of the details of all of our findings, we're going to share with you 3 key takeaways, compare that to what the literature has already found, and then suggest some paths forward. So our first key takeaway is just the lack of awareness around these existing programs and services in Quebec. As my colleagues shared, when we presented that flowchart to participants during the interviews, a lot of them were not aware of most of the programs and services on there, but at the same time, they knew of ones that we didn't even find using pretty thorough search methods. So it really just points to how difficult it is for families right now to find the correct services for them. And a lot of participants spoke about this in the interviews. So we compared this to previous literature, and we found that this is an issue across tons of different domains. For example, leisure programs for youth with physical disabilities in Quebec, parents have the same issues with finding resources online. They're not aware of what exists as well. So it's really widespread, this issue. And then in terms of paths forward, the literature suggests that clinicians should be brokers of this information, but we have an understanding that right now in Quebec's context, clinicians such as you guys don't have time to be searching for all of this information on top of your busy schedules. So what we would suggest is having databases of programs and services, like we've tried to do with the flowchart and like Keiko's team has tried to do with the Jouet app, that you guys can turn to when you need those resources. But one of the issues that always comes up is this changes over time. So every year it's something to think about, and maybe we can discuss afterwards, like who will be responsible for updating these over time, because it's one thing to put it together, but then it's always constantly changing as well. So into our next point. Our second key takeaway was the lack of programs and services for youth who really just need a little bit of extra support in order to integrate into the competitive labor market. So they're fairly functional already, but they just need a bit of a longer learning curve and some more job experience. So we were really trying to figure out, sort of at a higher level, why is there a mismatch between what's offered right now and what the youth need? So we looked at, in Quebec, the fact that services are really based on diagnostic labels in order to access them, and funding is given to organizations generally instead of individuals. And we want to compare this to what's being done in other places. So we looked at some programs in Australia. Right now, the National Disability Insurance Scheme has been rolled out since 2016. It's a really interesting concept that over time, perhaps with some advocacy, could be applied here as well. And what they do is actually a needs assessment, and then they provide funding directly to the individuals. And then the individuals have the buying power to decide where they're going to put their resources, which creates programs that actually fit their needs. So that's sort of at a higher level, some things that we could look at. Just go back, Hawk. In terms of paths forward, like a first step would be to create these programs for youth with this kind of profile that really focus on very practical skills building, real life scenarios, just developing enough experience to be able to integrate into the labor market. Also thinking about providing more individualized services. So instead of grouping youth based on their diagnosis, grouping them based on their actual profile and needs. And then in the longer term, perhaps turning to a system more like what's being rolled out in Australia right now, where individuals have the buying power, and then that drives the demand for services. Okay, and then our third key takeaway is the lack of communication and collaboration across the different sectors. We found that right now in Quebec, the health, education, and employment system are really operating in silos. And the relationships right now are very tricky because it's really based on individuals who have developed relationships with each other, but there isn't a structure or a network underlying this. So if somebody leaves their job or if the relationship isn't maintained, it just falls apart at the moment. So in the literature, we also found this. There's a lot of issues with collaboration across many domains. I'll point to just one study that talked about care coordination for chronic conditions, and they found that there were worse health outcomes and also higher costs when there is a lack of care coordination. So it's really to everyone's benefit to have good coordination here. So I'll show you on the next slide. This is definitely not an easy problem to solve, but I will present one sort of conceptual framework that we found in the literature and a few action points from it. So this study by Sherry and colleagues in 2016, they looked at 5 programs in the US that did a really excellent job of care coordination between health and social services. And they were trying to figure out like, what are the key aspects that make these 5 programs so good at collaboration. So what they found first was sharing information and data. And of course, we need to have set up systems in order to do so. The second was shared financing, which is a little bit different in Canada than the US. But I think one of the interesting takeaways was that funding should be available to be allocated towards creating these networks and relationships, not just to service provision. And then having shared leadership and vision as well was really important. And I think that's one of the aspects that would also develop trust between clinicians, is knowing somebody in another sector is going to provide the same quality of service as you would. So there's some potential steps that could be taken. A sort of bigger one would be having an overarching governance structure with representatives from health, from the education, and from the employment systems, and then them creating a shared vision together, sharing information and figuring out how to do that. Another practical first step could be to implement something like Collaborate, which one of our clinicians spoke about. It's a transition planning and information sharing tool that's implemented for youth with intellectual disabilities in BC. And it's actually interesting because the youth decide who has access to that. So that could be an interesting first step, but this is definitely not an easy problem to solve. And then we'll just discuss briefly some limitations and future directions. So in our study, we only had 19 participants. They all met sort of certain eligibility criteria and came from the same rehab center, and they all had some employment experience and were pretty functional. So overall, we can't really generalize our findings to the greater population. It's really only representative of our participants. And then in terms of future directions, it would be very interesting to expand this project across Canada, which is going to be done with the Labs project for Accessibility Standards Canada over the next couple years. So this will be done, and also to include youth who have more varied types and degrees of disability, who might have multiple disabilities or intellectual disabilities, and who come from more diverse backgrounds, particularly some from marginalized populations. And then finally, to identify some more stories of both employment success and failure to figure out where in that pathway that we presented are things either going right or going wrong. And here's some takeaways for you as clinicians. So first, everyone in our study really found that employment preparation should begin earlier, specifically during those high school years. And depending on the youth's goal, it might be really important to focus on employment instead of on academics and the difference of a couple of percentages in their grades during these years. Also to develop some programs tailored to youth who just need a little bit of extra preparation to integrate into the labor market. In terms of the skills that programs should really focus on developing, we found that self-awareness of their strengths and their weaknesses, their communication skills so that they can speak clearly to employers, and also their ability to advocate for themselves are really things that should be focused on. And of course, clinicians have a role in advocating as well. So you guys are the experts in this. So it's up to you to decide what you see going forward for employment of youth in Quebec. But we did have a few suggestions from our research for systems level collaboration, something like the Collaborate platform in BC, or having a governing body that coordinates, for services to be accessed based on the individual's needs and profile instead of just on diagnosis. And maybe in the longer term, advocating for something like that's being done in Australia, where funding is given to individuals instead of organizations. So that's it. Thank you. We would like to acknowledge everyone who helped us with our project, Chantal, Philippe, and all our study participants. And we're happy to answer any questions and discuss.
We have enough room to ask questions. I don't know if online you have any questions, you can raise your virtual hand or write in the chat. And in the meantime, transition team, do you have any questions for students? Yes.
I have a question. You might not be able to discern based on your participants' feedback, but were you able to piece apart the parent feedback, like the highlights or what the parents highlighted as barriers or issues, or and you might not have divided your participants that way, so it's okay if not, but I'd be curious about that more specific parent feedback.
I think it was very similar, right? We even felt like, why do we need to interview the parents sometimes? Because we had heard almost exactly the same thing from the youth. I'm not sure if anyone who remembers some of the parent ones found anything different, but I know there were a lot of similarities. Actually,
Yeah, exactly. Because all the parents that we interviewed were also of youth who we interviewed, and we typically interviewed the youth first. So then when the parents had the interview, they addressed a lot of the same barriers.
One of them was a couple. So we had like
Yeah, so they were both the of one, yeah.
Yeah. That's like one, but I'm sure differences, but the ones that we had is very similar. Okay.
One challenge on that I can discuss that in terms of visibility and time and availability. Ideally, it would be perhaps for the next part of the project where we're going on Canada-wide, it would be good to interview not the same diet, but like parents of youth, and then be able to sample like successful employed youth versus non-successful, and their parents, and then parents who are not on the same. So to have really be able to capture the full picture. Yeah, this is was more limited due to time and the parents were able to get.
But I know of the two parents that we did interview, they were really unaware of services and programs. They didn't know where to look to. So like when we told them about our flow chart, they were emailing us after being like, can you please provide us with that flow chart? Because like they didn't know where to look. So.
I wonder, like, I think, because I don't think youth, I mean, those are older youth, right? Like the youth interview. If there's a difference in interest, like knowing what's available, because I imagine, and speaking of Margin as a parent, like, so my kids are like 14 and 17. My 17-year-old started to be interested, but like very limited, like, oh, I want money, right? Summer jobs and find that, but not in exactly going and looking for what's the capacity building, right? The programs available, whereas this is a parent worry, right? So I don't know, but did you see that different? Like, or did the youth talk about like, oh, we don't know what's available, or they were more talking about the issues that they found on the ground?
I didn't know what was available too, but just like a general theme is it seemed like youth with disabilities waited until later to start thinking about jobs and that kind of thing. They really like the ones we spoke to want to focus on school and academics, maybe because they didn't have as much capacity to do two things at once, like the quote that we showed. So I don't think it was on their minds, like one of the participants said, until they were on the edge of 18, and then they're like, oh shoot, I'm trying to figure it out now, I'm graduating. But I think like their focus was really on academics while they were in school, was what we kind of heard.
Remind me the age range of the youth that you interviewed?
We'll go back to
I'll go
the
back to the
participant.
Yeah.
I think we had one who was it 15 was the youngest?
15, 25.
27 was the oldest, but most of them were early 20s, like 20 to 25.
I have a question. I don't know if you would know, or maybe you can know, just curiosity. We have this type of program which is supposed to have different stakeholders around youth transitioning to active living, to employment and all that. Is there an employment representative in that program? It's only school and health system and communities.
Are you talking about a capital professional?
The initial Ministry of Education vision of TEVA, what was it? Who did it involve? No, I don't think so.
So this vision would involve anyone who would have a involvement in the young adults' active life. So it would involve, other than just the school system, it would involve health system, it would involve community partners and employment. Now, how it is done right now with the resources that are available, it's another story. And it's I think it was very well highlighted in the presentation that it's very by silos, and the school silo is a hard one to even for us in healthcare, but I think that's definitely to either push forward for more collaboration or go back to what the intention of the TEVA was, with again for I don't know if you
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah,
The other aspect of that, like TEVA was made or developed many years ago, and I just read their programming. Employment partners were consulted initially to develop that with I think that collaboration in mind across the silos that we've now developed. But because it's so difficult, and I think we talked about this many times, that TEVA is not being implemented systematically across the board. So therefore it makes it even harder to establish that collaboration between the areas.
It also
yeah.
It also seems like it's more of like a yearly meeting. Like when we mentioned TEVA to participants, it often rang a bell, but they couldn't even remember what they did anymore because it was like a once a year meeting. They were like, I think maybe I did that, but it wasn't something that stuck with them, the TEVA program, but it was something that they thought maybe rang a bell.
Yeah, I think TEVA is a great example of something that looks great in paper. Yeah. I like that when we were reviewing all the 26 programs like from Quebec for this. Actually, that's how we got first call to do this project on review, because federal government is developing the standards, right, for employment for persons with disabilities, and the word out was that Quebec had a great model for youth employment for youth with disabilities, and that was largely based on that. And that's the first thing we review. And if you read through the documents, like it's perfect. It's really, really well thought. A lot like the Politica Balancea, it's like super well thought, right? Like details, all the stakeholders, everybody who needs to be at the table is called, consultations done, blah, blah, blah. But then implementation is always a different story, unfortunately. And I think that's something that this passage, and hopefully that we can continue to poke right on the conversation, is because I think this is at multiple gaps, right? Like, so one gap that is better addressed is the transition from childhood to adulthood, which the transition program, for example, was tapping and like trying to cover with like catching up, right? But that was a discussion for years, right? Like to even try to figure out in health rehab, right? Now that's that. Now to connect that to the same effort that has been done in education, which is then between education and community, and on the same transition to the world out there, and then what's employment versus what's employability, right? So this is also reflected on the pathways. Like one thing is the job search, or one thing is preparing to work, then job search, then first entry job, then following a career. Is it a career job or is it a just whatever job you can find? So that's I guess there it's not a simple issue for sure, but I think it's good to have a roadmap, right? Like I think that's hopeful that a program like TEV has thought this through, and I think that hopefully the flow chart is something that can help. Everybody have the information to say, okay, can we tap? Are those real, right? Like, is it a great thing on paper that has absolutely no good application, and then who do we need to talk to make sure that steps are taken? But yeah, that's hopefully something that I hope you can all keep working with us. That's a call to on the second part, because I think there is a real opportunity that with federal government, with the Accessible Canada Act, that they do have this one big agenda item that is on youth employment. So it's an opportunity to try and see how that applies in the province and how that compares to other provinces, because that's often also a good measure, right? So yeah, like the program in BC, I don't know what did you learn about, because that I haven't seen. Like, what did you review from this BC program?
Yeah, it was a program one of our clinicians brought up for youth with intellectual disabilities. And I think the interesting part of it is that youth decide who gets brought to the table instead of like a TEBA meeting where the TEBA people decide, oh, who's going to come to this meeting. For them, it's the youth who decides who's important in their life to have access. Yeah,
and that's called who runs it? Is the house? It doesn't have.
I don't have a ton of information on it. I have to look into it more, but
we had an online question. Have you come across the Texas School for the Blind Caring Wolf?
No, I didn't find that.
is that offered here?
No.
It's offered here?
No,
In Quebec?
no, it's Texas. Texas.
No.
That's Texas.
I don't. Are you? Where's the sound? Whoever asked, can you speak to that? Like, what is that? I didn't know about that.
Betty, do you want to open your mic? She's still on.
Oh, but then it would be good to. One question I wanted to ask to the clinicians, to the audience, for this question to bring it, is this issue of mild disabilities, right? Because that it's something that I've seen in other issues, like in leisure, it's a problem, and it's like, so for those youth who are like borderline, right? And like they don't have a severe enough disability that qualifies for a lot of the autism programs, like intellectual disability programs, physical, whatever. But that was, and I think the vast majority of the sample was on this category, right? And maybe those, because again, those youth who interviewed were part of the program, right? They're all part of the transition program, I guess.
And the employment evaluation orientation program at
right, so those are already the youth kind of served, right? Like we don't even know who is not there because we wouldn't have a way to find them, right? But so those are the youth who probably went through the regular school system. They might have been disconnected from rehab a while ago, right? They might have been in rehab for the first years, if much, or 12, right? The elementary to secondary school lost to follow up. So because they didn't need anything, right, major, until this becomes an issue, but again, it's not a major issue. So I don't know, do you have thoughts on that? And anyone online or all of you?
That was where this question kind of came from, because I mean, who was originally replaced, she was becoming that TEVA consultant on the health side. So in at Constance Lethbridge, and it was for all those clients or students that on the education side would receive like the TEVA meeting, and they would say, oh, you should be referred to healthcare again. But it was all for all those ones who got lost in the system, who were either discharged or moved on to school services, and then they came back. Like, well, now it's what do we have to offer them? Where can we direct them? And so that was the original need, right? So hopefully this will Making it easy,
Instrumentalized.
Clinicians to better provide those clients with those services and those needs, because they don't know where to go. They've fallen out of touch with rehab. And because the school system's not 100%, they're not reliable, but it's not consistent, it's not systematic. So yeah, definitely, I think that was the original need, and hopefully this will address it in part.
I think one big factor, or maybe a direction looking forward, I think you guys highlighted the type of skills that we need to help those youth develop. We need to foster that, and one of it was really self-awareness and knowing about yourself. So yes, strength and difficulties, but the next step is what type of accommodations do you need? And there's maybe a lack of information even for the youth themselves to know, well, if I'm going to the workplace, what do I need? And you have some ideas, but the accommodations that are offered typically in the school are quite different from what you would require in the workplace. But they don't have necessarily the opportunity to workshop it and problem solve and figure it out by trying. So there might be something there where if you go to a job and you don't know what to ask for, then how can the employer provide that to you?
Right.
And so it becomes kind of a situation where then to develop those skills, or for someone to tell you, well, you know, among the accommodations, there could be this and this and this. You need outside services like the ones that you've outlined there, but we also know that they're not well known to the youth. So it's kind of a chicken or the egg situation a little bit, and but more education towards what an adaptation or an accommodation is and what's realistic to ask for in the workplace and things like that could be definitely a first step.
Something along that line that some of the participants, one or two of them, talked about was they said it would be really nice to have a bank of stories of people with disabilities who have gone through this, entered the workplace with different disabilities, just sharing like what accommodations did I have when I entered the workplace. Now that I'm like 30, 35 and I've been doing this for a while, like having some sort of resource that's maybe not dry, but just like actual people's stories of what they did, what kind of jobs they could envision. Because some of the youth, they really want something based on their interests too, but they don't really know how to get there. They're still developing skills. So that was an interesting suggestion from one of the participants. Yeah, maybe reaching out to some that you've seen like 10 years ago now, 5 years ago.
We've been talking a lot about peer support and mentorship. How we can make that a possibility, and you're highlighting the fact that that's important at the employment level as well, so not just adult transition to adult services, but more specifically.
That's a really great idea to create a story. I mean, some of the quotes, like, or the study, like, we'll make them available for to use as might be useful. But it would be a mentorship system, because I think that connects to something that also came up in the interviews, which was the early experiences or the lack of, right? Like, so if you didn't have a lot of the skills, as we know, and in OT, it's like clinical practice, we know that things are not learned in rehab. I mean, they're learned in rehab, but they're only state if it's practiced in real world scenarios. So if we have a chance, like if they have a chance to start like early employment opportunities for those youth, exactly those who are not in a systematic rehab process, if they can start early with summer jobs and then have a chance to come back somewhere and talk about it, right? Like, oh, so that was easy, that was not, and then it's one summer job in at Tim Hortons that then you learn what you need to ask for the next interview, and then the traditional easy summer jobs that those experiences would actually help create the stories that will help them get it later on.
Yeah, and it's great for peers to discuss as they're going through that, but I think maybe a gap is for peers, for them to discuss with somebody who's already gone through it too. Right
Right.
now, there's peer support, like we're both 15 doing this together, but it would be interesting to have a program where they can talk to somebody who's 35 now and who's had sort of gone through
Yeah,
that
like a
trajectory
mentorship,
already.
yes, yeah.
Exactly.
Out of curiosity, in your healthcare system line, there's Project Tang, there's NAB. Is there a reason that there's not the evaluation orientation program at Constance?
Find it.
And I don't know. That's
It's good to know.
That's Charlotte's program,
Charlotte's
they cover
program.
the DM adult, DM and DL, language and motor, adult program. Which would be the equivalent of MAB, but MAB's for vision and auditory.
Oh, okay. Is there a reason why we don't? I'm looking at Mehrnoosh because that was part of the age range. Because that is what I don't. No, but that was the same age.
They would
group,
be
no?
18 and up.
Okay. Yeah, maybe I don't know why it didn't come up in the, so that, the first environmental scan was done as part of this, project for the federal government that we're looking to get back from. And, maybe that's the, I don't know.
I always think it's funny, but it's evaluation and orientation program. Charlotte, Charlotte's there, or may not be told saying no, she can talk about it.
And it's for employment specifically?
Yes.
Yeah.
Actually,
Because these are all just employment specifically, so that's
okay.
still related. Okay, yeah.
Go ahead, Charlotte.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, the sound is really bad. So I just heard my name a few times and I heard, oh, could you please repeat the gist of what you were just talking about? I'm very sorry. Like I said, the sound is really bad where I'm at right now.
Yeah, we were mentioning that O was not in the healthcare system line on their pathways. I was just wondering if there was a reason or if it fit in another category or we were promoting your program, Charlotte.
Thank you. Thank you. I thought I saw it in the social vocational integration, but that's more in the education system. You're right. We're not in the healthcare there. Yeah, and there's also the SAE, le SAE pour MAB. Like, was that what you included as the Montreal Association for the Blind? Was that the le SAE, le soutien à l'employabilité, or?
So,
That's for the vision.
yeah, there was a vision in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's fun.
Do you want to have a little bit more information about the return toward the EO program at Lethbridge? That's what I think that's what I understand.
Sure.
Yeah, I wonder
Yeah.
if is the information like in the internet, because the initial environmental scan was not. It is.
It's on the LLMR, Lethbridge Lake Mackay Rehab Center website.
And it would be in the same place as the MAB, like, so that's fine. Yeah, I don't know if that's a good.
Seems like every time we present it, there's new ones that come
Yeah, well, just to clarify, the the EO program at Lethbridge is for DP clients. So it's déficience physique, and it's for 18 and up. But we do have a transition agent, Amélie Labelle, who will go into. I think that you mentioned it at some point, that she will make sure that the youth transition from coming from school, that it transitions smoothly toward the adult world of rehab. But it's really physical that we see here at Lethbridge. The other déficience visuelle, déficience linguistique, they will be seen in déficience auditive at the MAB or the Mackay. But it's mainly physical that we see here. And I don't know if you had other questions. It's a little bit hard to hear you through the microphone. I don't know. It's
Yeah, I mean that's if anything, that shows that even rural systematic search still fails to find something from someone who was directly involved in the program. So that's a flag. But
Yeah, transition is not our agent. Yeah, it's not mentioned in the on the website because it's still a new service that we offer since this spring. So it's still new, but it should be added to the website.
But yeah, that should be added, Charlotte, but you still offer services for employment for motor and language clients.
Well, yes, if they have a DP, if there's only language or if it's only déficience visuelle ou auditive, we will direct them to the MEB or we will work with the SAE.
Language is a case-by-case basis.
Yes.
so perhaps something that I don't know if you can hear me, Shamla, but something we can do.
Yes.
Yes. Something good would be we'll give so we created the flow chart and we'll give it to you and all of you who are in the call as a first group to take one last look and see also like you identified this is missing or if you know of something else because that happened a lot, right? Like as they said, they added a lot as people were even if the search was as through as possible. And then you can add if there's anything else that is missing, we can add to make sure that it's as comprehensive as possible. And then when we have this, then we'll put on the, I mean, you'll have access to the PDF with the links, but we'll also put on the link on the Childhood Disability Link website to, with the links to the links, that to make this available and that the link you can share, like to share with clients and families and whatever. So make sure to do that and to add what's missing. Yes, any other questions online or there was that's I think it's an old one.
Oh, sorry, I didn't take it down.
Well, thank you. Anyway, thank you, Charlotte and Julianne, for your supervision as well. Thank you, everyone. We'll be sharing the recording and the presentation and the information we'll have to share on our website as well. So I'll have a lesson. Thanks. Thank you.